the Church of Our Lady of Candelaria. The important symbol of Catholicism in Rio de Janeiro has witnessed numerous political and social events, such as the Direitas Já rally and many others. Unfortunately, it was also the scene of a crime that shook Brazil and the world. Approximately 70 children and adolescents inhabited the areas around Candelária without access to decent housing, education, health, or proper leisure. Forgotten by society, these were children deprived of childhood, surviving as best they could, exposed to all forms of violence and neglect. Society only became aware of these human beings when the violence against them reached its peak on the night of July 23, 1993. That night, 4 police officers fired indiscriminately at the young people, resulting in the death of 8 children and youths aged between 11 and 19, and leaving dozens of others injured. What was the motivation behind this massacre? How did the legal process and trial unfold? What happened to the survivors? And what reflections does this case bring to Brazilian society and the law? These are the questions we will seek to answer in this video. In the afternoon of July 23, 1993, a trade union central held a demonstration near the Church of Candelaria, necessitating the presence of the military police. Among the officers was Marcos Vinicius Emanuel, 26 years old. He decided to approach one of the youths present, Marcos Antonio da Silva, better known as Come Gato, who was only 16. He survived by committing small thefts and was seen as one of the leaders among the children and young people of Candelaria. The officer suspected that the youths were hiding shoemaker's glue, which was being used as an intoxicant. The approach resulted in a dispute between the youths and the officer, who decided to take Come Gato to the police station. Amid protests and insults from the other youths in retaliation, they vandalized the police vehicle by breaking one of its windows. Marcos Vinicius then decided to take another youth to the station. However, shoemaker's glue is not considered an intoxicant under drug law. Therefore, its possession is not considered a crime. Thus, upon arriving at the station, the youths were released. This enraged Marcos Vinicius Emanuel and made him the butt of jokes within the battalion. According to investigations, these were the reasons that led him to commit the massacre. At 11 p.m. that night, a car passed by the place where the boys sleep. The occupants of the vehicle threatened the youths, shouting that their day was coming and that everyone would die. At 11:30 p.m., 3 youths, including Wagner dos Santos, were walking toward the church when a car stopped near them. The armed occupants forced them into the vehicle. The kidnappers were not wearing uniforms and were driving an ordinary car. However, Wagner dos Santos recounts that one of them identified himself as a police officer and asked for their documents. It is not exactly known what these men's intentions were, whether they meant to kill the youths or merely scare them. But during the trip, one of them accidentally fired a shot, hitting Wagner dos Santos. Because of that shot, the men decided to get rid of the youths. They took them to a spot near the Museum of Modern Art at the Flamengo landfill, where, executed by gunfire, the men left. Miraculously, Wagner survived the shots. Realizing that the other 2 youths were dead, he fled to a gas station, writhing in pain. Meanwhile, the car continued toward the Church of Candelaria, where children and youths were sleeping. The occupants of the car arrived and began asking the children, "Where is Come Gato?" Then the massacre began, with shots fired at the youths. 6 victims were seriously injured, and 8 died. The police arrived at the scene of the massacre. Lieutenant Cortez was informed about Wagner and went to the gas station where he was in agony. He called an ambulance to rescue him, but it did not arrive, so Lieutenant Cortez decided to take Wagner in the patrol car to the hospital. Wagner survived and became a key figure in the investigations. The following morning after the massacre, international pressure began to mount for an investigation and punishment of the murderers. The case was no longer merely a matter for criminal investigation, but had also become a political issue. Could Brazil, popularly known as the country of impunity, truly investigate a crime of this magnitude, especially when the initial reports indicated police involvement? The underage survivors were taken to the police station to give their testimonies. However, the information obtained was inconsistent. Some of the boys pointed the finger at two police officers known as Pelé and Ch1ldr3n, nicknames given to them because they worked as a pair, with one of them being black. These two officers were known by the street children for always terrorizing and threatening them, yet there was no additional evidence that they had participated in the murders. The officer known as Ch1ldr3n presented his alibi through his brother-in-law, a locksmith who claimed that he had been drinking with Ch1ldr3n at the time of the crime. Wagner, the massacre survivor, still recovering in the hospital, recognized the officer, Marcos Vinicius. Emmanuel photographed him, the same man who had clashed with the miners and detained Come Gato. He also identifies Lieutenant Cortez as one of those involved in the murders, the very officer who rescued him and saved his life. Both were arrested. The other survivors of the massacre were taken back to the police station for identification procedures. With their faces covered, they were led into a chaotic environment filled with journalists and shouts from the cells. In this scene of confusion and disorder, the miners were forced to identify the culprits, a process that has sparked clear criticism of the identification system and the responsibility imposed on victims already traumatized by the horror they endured. These victims are expected to have the capacity to recognize their aggressors, a procedure prone to errors that can lead to injustice. As a result of the identifications, 3 people were arrested, only to later be declared innocent. 3 years later, the officers known as Ch1ldr3n and Pelé are not identified by the miners, but there are still indications that one of the murderers was black. The police then begin searching for a black officer from the 5th Battalion, operating in the Candelária area. They discover a black soldier from the reserved service of the military police. This soldier is summoned to participate in the identification process. He is identified as one of the murderers and arrested, despite claiming innocence. Some journalists confirm an alibi for the soldier, who claimed to have been at the church on the day of the incident. His superiors recognized him as an exemplary officer, and not even the civil police investigators. Although his involvement was believed, that was not enough to prevent him from spending 3 years in prison. Also, his brother-in-law was summoned from the police station to confirm his alibi, which claimed that he had been with him on the night of the crime. While at the station, Ch1ldr3n's brother-in-law was called to participate in an identification lineup as a witness, since the Criminal Procedure Code requires the presence of other people in the identification room. Then something unexpected happened. The miners identified Ch1ldr3n's brother-in-law as the 4th murderer, a man who works as a locksmith and who does not belong to the police forces. Nevertheless, the case was declared solved in record time, with 4 people accused and held in pre-trial detention while awaiting trial.